This is Learning with Coach History. This is the fourth and final lesson in World War I. Wilson fights for peace. In this lesson, you'll learn about the treaty that ended the war and about Wilson's proposal for a League of Nations. The key terms and people: 14 points, self-determination, League of Nations, Charles Clemenceau, David Lloyd George, Treaty of Versailles, reparations, war guilt clause, and Henry Cabot Lodge. President Wilson presented his plan for world peace to Congress in January of 1918. The plan was called his 14 points. The first 5 points suggested ways that wars could be avoided. They stated that 1. Countries should not make secret treaties with one another. 2. Freedom of the seas should be maintained. 3. Tariffs should be lowered or ended to promote free trade. 4. Countries should reduce their arms. And 5. The interests of the colonial people should be considered. The next 8 points suggested a new national boundary. Wilson believed in self-determination. Different ethnic groups should be given the ability to decide for themselves what nation they belong to. The 14th point called for a League of Nations. This international organization would address problems between countries before they led to war. Wilson met with leaders of France and Great Britain, George Clemenceau and David Lloyd George, to discuss the terms of peace. These leaders had won the war, and they wanted to punish Germany. The Paris Peace Conference had been set up exactly with punishment in mind. In fact, the defeated Central Powers were excluded from the conference. So too was Russia, which now had a communist government. Wilson was an idealist. He hoped the other leaders at the conference would share his dream of restoring peace to Europe without punishing Germany too much. However, he soon realized that the result of the meeting would not be in his favor. In the end, Wilson had to give up most of his 14 points. The one he insisted on was the League of Nations. One example was Vietnam in Southeast Asia. The Vietnamese people wanted to gain political rights. Wilson brought the treaty back to the United States for approval. He found several groups strongly opposed to it. Some thought the treaty too harsh. Others thought it favored imperialists. Some ethnic groups objected to the treaty because of the way it treated their homelands. The main opposition to the treaty was over the League of Nations. The League was the only one of Wilson's 14 points that was included in the treaty. Conservative senators headed by Henry Cabot Lodge opposed joining the League. They did not like the idea of working with other countries to take economic and military actions against aggression. They wanted the treaty to include the constitutional right of Congress to declare war. Wilson refused to compromise on the League. He believed that the League would allow nations a place to discuss disagreements and to reconcile them. He saw the League as a pathway to peace. Therefore, he would not accept amendments to the Treaty of Versailles that were proposed by Republican leaders. The Republican majority of Senate had felt left out when Wilson had not included many Republicans as representatives of the American delegation in Versailles. Wilson's unwillingness to compromise about the League of Nations dismayed them even more. As a result, the Senate failed twice to ratify the treaty. The United States never entered the League of Nations. It finally signed a separate treaty with Germany in 1921 when Wilson was no longer president. The end of the war made Americans yearn for what Warren G. Harding called normalcy. But the war had transformed the United States and the world. World War I had strengthened both U.S. military power and the power of government. It accelerated change for African Americans and women. However, the propaganda campaign left a legacy of mistrust and fear. In Europe, the war left a legacy of massive destruction, loss of life, political instability, and violence. Communists ruled in Russia, and soon after the war, fascist organizations seized power in Italy. Americans hoped that the war had convinced the world to never fight again. But in Europe, the war settled nothing. In Germany, Adolf Hitler exploited Germans' discontent with the Treaty of Versailles and threatened to fight again. Hitler was true to his predictions. America did have to fight again years later in the Second World War.